Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, ranging from nutrition to physical and mental health. I am Amanda Hayes, your host, a nutritionist with a passion for well-being. Before I introduce today's guest, I would like to take a moment to let you know that you can subscribe to my podcast, which includes interviews with experts in the fields of nutrition, physical health, mental health, and my 5-minute food facts series. You can subscribe on YouTube, hit the red subscribe button, or on your favourite podcast app, including iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. I will also mention that although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure, or prevent injuries or medical conditions, and it is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today, I am here with Sam Alfred. Sam and I have been friends since our university days, and Sam is an emergency medicine consultant working in the emergency department of a very busy hospital, and he is also a clinical toxicologist. So today we're going to focus on his role as a toxicologist, and particularly we're going to talk about snakebite, something which is of interest to any of you listeners out there who like to trail run, hike, or ride mountain bikes. Hello, Sam, and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast.
Howdy.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for coming in.
Well, don't leap to conclusions too soon.
So I thought we'd start by asking Sam about his path to becoming a doctor. So what inspired you to study medicine?
Lack of viable alternatives. I started off thinking that I wanted to be a diplomat.
Aha.
And started doing Asian languages and heading towards law, and then realised I was no good at law and I had no natural diplomacy skills at all. I had to come up with something else. So medicine was an interesting fallback plan.
Oh, I think that sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, it worked out well. I'd have been a terrible lawyer.
Yeah, well, I think you've got a get out of jail free card there, Sam.
Well, as it turns, you just don't know, do you, when you're 17?
Of course you don't know.
I landed on my feet a little bit, I think.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And then you studied in emergency medicine, which I would imagine is one of the more stressful specialties. So what drew you to that?
Well, actually, it's quite fun.
It is?
I guess what drew me to it was the variety and the procedural aspect of things, and the fact that you're involved in the nitty-gritty kind of, dirty's the wrong word, but the the difficult periods of people's lives, which is kind of nice to be able to help people through. And often the people we're seeing don't have a lot in the way of community supports and other avenues to medical intervention, so it's quite satisfying.
Right. So you're actually really making a difference.
Well, you feel like you are. I don't know.
Well, I guess keeping someone alive
well, there's
will
some
do
immediate
that.
satisfaction to that. Yeah.
Mm. Is there a lot of follow-up care with these patients, or
zero, which is great?
Yeah. Definitely not a diplomat.
Exactly.
And one of Sam's many talents, apart from diplomacy, is that he has set up a toxicology department here in Adelaide. So first of all, can you explain to us what is toxicology?
Well, it's the management of poisonings and envenomations, basically. So, most of what we do is managing self-harm, overdoses, and most of that's with sort of pharmaceuticals that people have taken to try and harm themselves. And we manage snake bite, spider bite, chemical exposures,
right?
That sort of spectrum of toxicity.
If someone comes in into the emergency department and they've taken some kind of toxin, I'm not sure what all the correct terms are, do you then, what if they're non-responsive, how do you then know how to treat them?
It's relatively, I guess you look for the clinical signs that might support a diagnosis. I mean, most of what people take is what's readily available to them.
Right.
So generally it's prescription drugs, and if you're talking specifically about prescription drugs that make you unconscious, there aren't a whole lot that actually do that, and the ones that do have, take for example oxycodone, an opiate type thing. Has a characteristic set of signs that go along with it. It slows your respiratory rate, makes your pupils small, slows your heart rate down, causes a little bit of a drop in your blood pressure, but not too much. And there's an antidote to it, so you can give a little test dose of that, and people will respond or not respond if you're treating the right thing. So it's a bit of a process of matching probabilities with clinical signs that support that, and interventions that work or don't work.
Yes, and hopefully work.
Yeah.
And I'd like to focus today on snake bite as one of your areas in the toxicology department, because a lot of our listeners are either trail runners or hikers or mountain bike riders, so they're spending time up on the trails where you're obviously more likely to come into contact with a snake. First of all, when is snake season in Australia?
Well, snake bites are more common in spring and summer, because spring is their breeding, mating season. So they're out and about and on the prowl, and they're much more active in the warmer weather. Cold-blooded animals that kind of need heat to get them going.
They'll be lying on the path or the trail or something. And I guess this ties in very much with the previous question, but is there a time of day when you're more likely to be bitten by a snake?
Well, I guess the times at which you're likely to run into a snake are the times at which your behavioural patterns coincide with the snake's behavioural pattern. So, in the early part of the day, that snake's trying to warm itself up and get moving, and so it'll find somewhere nice and sunny to sit, and that's when people tend to be, post-school drop-offs and the rest of it going out for a run. So I suppose that's probably the most likely time point. Once there's been a whole bunch of people through a trail, snakes are pretty good at avoiding humans. So once a few people have gone through, and particularly dogs and things have gone through and have laid a scent trail down, then the snakes are pretty good at staying out of the way from that sort of time point on.
Because they don't want to come into contact with humans.
No, they really don't want to. They'll do everything they can to stay out of your way.
Right, okay. And at night time, do they sleep, or what do they do? I don't know anything about snakes.
Well, I should say I'm not a herpetologist, so, I'm not
Didn't even know what that word was.
A snake specialist.
Yes.
I guess what I manage is the bit from the fang onwards. But so I'm not a particular expert in snake behavioural patterns, but there are diurnal variations in the way snakes behave. Some of them are out and about during the day, tiger snakes, brown snakes, those sorts of things. Other ones are more active at night time, mulga snakes and things, for example. So there are differences in behavioural patterns amongst the different species of snake. They hunt at different times.
So you're never safe. That's what I'm hearing.
They're always out there.
They're always out there.
Well, you're actually pretty safe in Australia. We actually don't get, despite the reputation of our snakes, we A, don't get all that many bites, and B, get very, very few deaths. Compared to our Southeast Asian kind of neighbours. Yeah.
In fact, I read somewhere that we get about 2 deaths a year in Australia.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. I mean, snakes get a particularly bad rap. I mean, the reputation of Australian snakes as being particularly deadly is a potency-based argument. You don't need much venom to cause an effect. But often our snakes bite and don't inject venom at all. And our medical supportive care is pretty good. We have good antivenom. So, the chances of actually coming to significant medical harm post-snake bite are pretty small in Australia.
That's very comforting for Australians out there. So what are the most common snakes that...
Well, the single most common one's the brown snake.
The brown snake,
yeah, definitely. I mean, the most common venomous snakes are the brown, by far and away. The most common tiger, taipan, death adder, and the mulga snake, and red belly black snakes. So they're sort of the big ones in terms of venomous species. We have sea snakes in Australia in the north as well.
Right. Oh, in the north. Okay, good. We're safe.
Yeah, but I don't like the cold water.
I guess those ones that you mentioned, they're the most common venomous snakes, you said. So in terms of if one should see a snake, what's the best course of action?
Well, if you just stand still, the snake's going to go away.
Is that right?
They're really not going to bite you unless you tread on them inadvertently or startle them up very close. And if you give them any chance to move away, they will. They're not ever going to attack you.
Right. Okay. So stand still.
Yep.
Don't try and beat them off with a stick or something like that.
Throw them to your friend or
Yeah.
use them as a lasso.
No. If you have the misfortune of actually getting bitten, say you don't see the snake, you step on it, and in defence it bites you, what's the best way to deal with it?
Well, essentially the best thing you can do is stay as still as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously you've got to balance that up against where you are and how likely it is you're going to be found. But snake venom initially is injected underneath the skin. Snake fangs, Australian snake fangs anyway, are very, very small, and they don't create deep puncture wounds. They create sort of scrapings and very shallow injections of venom into the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. And the initial spread is through the lymphatic system and venules, very small components of the vascular system. And spread through those systems is promoted by muscle contraction and movement. So if you stay still, there's no muscle contraction, no movement, and the venom tends to stay at the bite site for much longer. And if you put a compression bandage around it and occlude those lymphatics and small venules, then you slow it even further.
Right.
And Australian snake bites, for the most part, perhaps with the mulga snake being the exception, don't cause local toxicity. So all of their toxicity is once it's made it into the bloodstream and disseminated to a distant site of action, like the kidney or nervous system. So if you trap it in the limb, you don't have a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, unless you're 7 hours away from
help. Yeah, which hopefully for most of us that's not the case. What are the typical symptoms then?
Well, the typical symptom is absolutely nothing.
Is that right?
That's right.
Pain?
Yeah. No, they don't tend to hurt. Again, they've got very small fangs, and at most they tend to feel like a scratch.
Okay.
A lot of people don't even know they've been bitten.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're really not. Local bite site pain is really not a feature other than with mulga snakes and death adders, which have larger fangs, and in the case of the mulga snake, some local toxicity. But we don't have those immediately around the Adelaide Hills region, so it's not particularly a problem for us. And brown snakes, tiger snakes, taipans, they tend to cause very little in the way of local bite site pain. And about 50% of snake bites don't have any venom injected. So a significant number of people will never get any systemic effects by virtue of that. And the people that do, if they're going to get any symptoms, tend to get a fairly non-specific set of initial problems like nausea and vomiting and abdominal pain and just feeling horrible.
Okay.
So it's not a particularly specific set of findings.
If you are bitten by a snake and you know that that's happened, how do you know then whether you've had venom injected or not?
You don't.
You don't. Okay. So you should always go to
the
hospital.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the process of medically demonstrating that you haven't had any venom injected is quite a long one.
I see.
It takes us about 12 hours to definitively rule it out.
Right.
Because we're looking for evolving changes on serial blood tests and evolving neurological signs on repeated examination over the course of the first 12 hours or so. If you've got through the first 12 hours without anything occurring, the chances are you're going to be absolutely fine.
Right. If you are bitten by a snake and venom has been injected, is there a universal antivenom or do you need a specific one for each type of snake?
Well, we do. Australia makes a polyvalent antivenom. So there are polyvalent and monovalent antivenoms, and polyvalent antivenom is an antivenom that includes sort of one dose of antivenom for each of the Australian snakes of significance. So there's one dose of taipan, tiger snake, brown snake, mulga, death adder in there. So you can use that to treat everything. The monovalent antivenoms are targeted at a particular species. So it'll only work for brown snake if it's brown snake antivenom. It'll only work for tiger snake if it's tiger snake antivenom. The advantage of using the monovalent ones is they're a much smaller volume and adverse effects are directly volume related. We tend to ideally try and use in preference the monovalent antivenoms, which you can usually do by working out what sorts of snakes are around the vicinity where the patient's been bitten and coupling that with their symptoms and signs and the results of their blood tests. So, and there is a venom detection capability as well, if you can get a sample of the venom.
Okay. And I also read somewhere that you should not try and wipe any venom off, for example, because sometimes you can identify it from traces on your clothing. And is that correct?
Around the bite site, yeah. This is the venom detection. I think you're talking about. There's a venom detection kit made by Sequirus, who and the aim of that is to guide antivenom selection. So it doesn't directly. So the process is that you take a swab of venom, usually from the bite site. You can do it on urine, but it's much less accurate. And you look at a thing called an ELISA assay, which is an immunoassay that generates a colour change in response to the presence of venom and tells you which antivenom would be most appropriate to treat that venom.
Okay.
It doesn't actually tell you whether the patient needs it.
I see.
And it isn't always right.
Right.
And it's probably fair to say that the reliance on that over the years has reduced substantially as people get more and more familiar with what snakes exist in a given territory and how to diagnose the envenomation syndromes clinically.
Right. Oh, that's good to know. Just moving on, Sam is involved in a project in Myanmar, a snakebite project, and I believe that's supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in partnership with the Australian antivenom producer Sequirus, the University of Adelaide and the Government of Myanmar. I believe this is part aid focused and part research, this project. So what's the aim of the project from a research point of view?
The research was in fact a spin-off. Our involvement there was entirely in terms of its funded activity. It was entirely an aid program. So
I see.
So the Myanmar government asked the Australian government for some assistance with the management of snakebite in Myanmar, and specifically with the management of a specific snake. They've got a huge problem with a snake called Russell's viper over there and through all of Southeast Asia, really. But Myanmar have a very significant problem there, particularly in terms of the ability of this snake to cause renal failure.
Dear.
And they have an enormous load of patients who require dialysis to treat renal failure secondary to Russell's viper bite. So the Myanmar government asked the Australian government for some assistance in the management of snakebite, which the group that you've identified helped to provide. And essentially what that was, so that was a Myanmar snakebite project was the term of the project. And what we were doing was looking at management from the point of antivenom production right through to antivenom administration and clinical management. And most of the real success we had was aimed at increasing volume of antivenom production and quality of antivenom production and improving their cold chain supply support for the antivenom through to the point of administration and eventually creating a lyophilized antivenom, which is a freeze-dried antivenom which doesn't need a cold chain at all.
Brilliant.
So most of the real impact we had was around those sorts of manufacturing processes and setting up an audit tool, which doesn't sound very sexy or exciting, but was actually very effective because they had very little information about the numbers of bites and where they were presenting and how they were being managed and what the consequences of that treatment was. So we were able to set up quite an advanced audit tool that allowed them to map what was happening in terms of snakebite within a couple of high prevalence areas and profile their treatment approaches and identify which bits were working and which bits weren't.
Well, that sounds like a really good result.
Yeah, and then that led to research questions that spun off the side of it. That wasn't part of the funded arm of the project.
Right, so it was an aid project, as you said. When you talk about production of antivenom, is that locally, as in
they've
Myanmar?
always made their own antivenom. Right. The problem with species like Russell's viper, and it's true of all snakes, but snakes that exist across a broad geographic terrain tend to have varying venom components throughout that terrain because they're eating different things and so they need to kill different things, and so they generate over time different sort of subtly different venom components. And what that means is that an antivenom made in another country doesn't necessarily work for your snake, even though it's the same snake.
I see.
And the renal failure issue in Myanmar is essentially a Myanmar-specific manifestation of Russell's viper envenoming that you don't see very much in other countries. So they had been buying antivenom from India and finding that it wasn't really working.
Right.
And then they had been making their own, but weren't able to manufacture enough to meet their requirements and were having quality control issues, and so they had, industrial needs to try and
So that's where you
that
came
process.
in.
Yeah.
In terms of renal failure, if the snake bite is treated on time with the correct antivenom, then I assume it doesn't progress to that stage?
Well, unfortunately not.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah. Now, what we were able to demonstrate through the audit process that we'd put in place was that giving antivenom early clearly made a difference to the number of people getting renal failure, but it didn't completely reduce the risk to zero by a long shot. There's still very, very significant numbers of people getting renal failure. So it was protective to some extent if you got it early, but not 100% protective. And that raised a whole lot of questions about things like dosing and efficacy, and that's where the research sort of components of the issue come into play.
I wonder, is there sufficient dialysis machines in Cambodia?
Well, historically, no.
Myanmar?
Historically, no. And tragically, they had previously found themselves in a situation where they could offer people a fixed number of dialysis sessions, typically about 3, and that wasn't enough to get them through the envenomation syndrome. So historically, they were in the very unfortunate position of being able to partially treat with a suboptimal antivenom and then initiate dialysis for a defined period of time, and then found themselves having to withdraw that care because it was no longer funded, and the local population just can't afford to pay it for themselves, obviously. No. That situation had resolved itself before we got there, and the Myanmar government had put quite a lot of money into improving dialysis resources, and they are now and had been prior to our arrival able to support people with dialysis through the duration of the envenomation-induced renal failure, which for most people is about 2 weeks, a little bit less.
So they recover from it. That's
most
what
people
I'm understanding.
do.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's good.
There are quite a large chunk of people who don't and are then dialysis dependent for the duration of their lives unless they get a transplant. And obviously transplants in Myanmar are problematic.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Sam, it sounds like your group is doing some really good and valuable work over there, so that's great. And then if we just wind up with a couple of questions about working in a busy emergency department. So what's the most common, I think you alluded to this in the beginning, but what's the most common sort of issue you see in terms of toxicology or drug overdose in an emergency department?
Well, I suppose broadly speaking, there are 3 different groups of poisoning. So, leaving the envenomations aside for the moment, and that you could broadly group them into deliberate self-harm, where people have taken an overdose with the intent of killing themselves or harming themselves, and that's usually in the Australian setting prescription drugs.
Right.
And then there's another group of quite a large group of people who present as a consequence of recreational drug use. And then there's a third quite small subset in the Australian setting of people who've got chemical exposures, usually in the workplace or things like that. So, it's the intentional overdoses and the recreational drug use around by far our biggest groups of patients. And we see about 1,000 patients a year at the Royal Adelaide with those sorts of problems. So
I see.
Quite a lot of people.
Oh, that is a lot. And what's the most, in terms of recreational drugs, what would be the most common drug, do you think, out there? Alcohol, yeah.
And in the context of the emergency department, it's not alcohol to the point of intoxication. It's alcohol to the point of unconsciousness, violence, aggression.
Wow.
Yeah, that is by far and away our biggest problem.
Yeah, that's interesting, because if you read the media, you would assume it would be ice.
You would.
Gets a lot of coverage.
Yeah, and the methamphetamine is the single most common illicit drug that we see. But ethanol, so alcohol, is at the same sort of level, and benzodiazepines and prescription opiates are not that far behind.
Right.
So you put together our socially acceptable, if you want, for want of a better term, family of drugs: alcohol, benzodiazepines, and prescription opiates, and that's much more of an issue numerically than methamphetamine. Methamphetamine patients do tend to be difficult.
Yeah,
they tend to be violent and aggressive and not terribly pleasant. So they create a large footprint.
Yes, yeah. It's quite disruptive, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it is a very significant problem.
I guess with as you said, socially acceptable drugs, they're easier to get hold of. So it's more likely that a greater number of people will be exposed.
And there's also a social tolerance for the outcomes associated with it. We do, regrettably, quite frequently see fairly young people who found themselves in very precarious situations, and the response of family members, if the cause of that's been alcohol, is often a little bit unusual. There's an acceptance of it as being, she was just drunk, or he was just drunk, and you don't get that sort of tolerance with methamphetamine.
No.
People, if you're behaving poorly and methamphetamine's the cause, there's an intolerance of the outcomes of that behaviour. Whereas I think as a society, for some reason, we seem to be relatively okay with poor behaviour if it's caused by ethanol for some reason.
Interesting. Alcohol intake is definitely a social problem in Australia, and perhaps a subject of another podcast. Well, it's good to know that we have some very capable emergency doctors out there available to look after us when we perhaps take the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or get bitten by the wrong thing. So, Sam, thank you for coming on today. And I like to finish the podcast by asking all my guests if you could recommend 2 things that you think people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be?
I was kind of dreading this question.
Oh, you don't have to answer.
I'm not much of a social philosopher, but maybe don't take yourself too seriously.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Do something interesting. I don't know. I don't have any great pearls, but some vague.
Don't get bitten by a snake.
Avoid.
Don't drink too much alcohol.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that was Sam Alfred. To put snakebite into perspective for you, in 2018, before his death, Kofi Annan said, "Snakebite is the biggest public health crisis you have likely never heard of. Every year globally, snakebite kills between 81,000 and 138,000 people, and it also causes long-lasting disabilities in another 400,000 people. With prompt access to the right antivenom, snakebite is rarely fatal, but in countries without strong health systems and antivenom stockpiles, every 5 minutes someone dies of snakebite and another 4 will be permanently disabled." Recently, in May this year, the World Health Organization launched its roadmap, which aims to halve the death and disability from snakebite by 2030. So let's hope that is a successful program. You can subscribe to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, and while you're there, click on the bell to be alerted when new episodes are available. You can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app, including iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify and Google Podcasts. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Direct links to all social media can be found on the subscribe page of my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com. If you would like to contact me, you can send me a message via the contacts page on my website. Please feel free to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about or guests you'd like to hear interviewed, and I'll do my best to deliver that to you. Finally, please take a minute to leave a rating on iTunes. It improves visibility and will inspire me to keep finding interesting guests in the wellbeing space. Thank you for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.